This is our third and final video in our deep dive series on the parrying techniques of Meyer's Sidesword. In the previous video, we were introduced to 8 different parrying techniques from Meyer's 1570 Sidesword text. Each of these serves admirably when used in the right context, protecting us from attack and providing an opportunity for a riposte, and we could certainly end our exploration here. However, as you may recall, in parts 1 and 2 of this series, I described 2 categories of understanding of fencing. The first is technique, the how of a movement from a mechanical perspective. For example, absetzen is a technique. And the second is principles, which is a set of general heuristics or concepts around which we can base our fencing. Some of these principles relate directly to the technique itself, for example footwork, body movement, and considerations of structural advantage, such as the interaction between strong and weak. A second category of principle is time. Now I'm using time here as a catch-all term, which includes both time and distance, because the two are intrinsically linked when it comes to fencing. Technique and time are joined by a third category, tactics. Tactics is a set of actions we use to achieve an effect in this case being a generalized outcome without a strictly defined technique, and it includes concepts such as provocations, preparatory actions to set up an attack, and elements of psychology. These 3 elements, technique, timing, and tactics, form the foundation of good fencing, and while any one of them can be useful in isolation, they function best when unified. Of course, it would be almost impossible to do justice to all 3 categories in a single video. So we'll limit ourselves to a number of observations which touch on each of the categories, and then draw some heuristics and concepts which we can then use to improve our fencing. This is all based on my own take on Meyer's system and the approach that I use, and if you've watched other videos on the channel, you'll find some familiar themes. I'll also be highlighting the textual support for this approach, as well as showing compatibility with the earlier German fencing systems which form the basis of Meyer's techniques. In order to make these observations and derive some principles, let's review the techniques that we've looked at in the previous videos. First, we have absetzen, a thrust in opposition and a move offline against a mid to high level attack. Next, we have taking out with the false edge, a broad rising percussive parry. Another percussive parry is suppressing, in which we use the true edge in a descending action along with a move offline. Against a mid-level attack below our hilt, we use taking out with the hanging blade, which is a descending semicircular parrying action accompanied by a withdrawal backward from the line. We also have slicing off, a descending oppositional parry with a move offline. Similarly, we have going through with the hanging blade. This is a disengage in an oppositional expulsion similar to slicing off. We have hanging, which is a rising parry with the flat with a move offline, and is especially useful against high to mid-level cutting actions. Finally, we have barring, a descending percussive parry against leg attacks. The first observation that we can make is that in their basic form, all of these techniques are 2-tempo actions consisting of a parry and a riposte. Now you might question why I'm bringing this up. After all, parry riposte is hardly a revolutionary concept and not really a principle that we need to highlight in a video like this one. However, it does bring our focus to a foundational principle of Meyer's system, the priority of a secure defense over simple attack. Meyer expresses this in his second rule of sidesword fencing. You should not cut to the body until you have made yourself secure with parrying. This defense-centric approach helps to avoid doubles. After all, simply countercutting at the opponent with reckless abandon resembles not combat, but rather a mindless peasant's brawl. Practicalities aside, this highlights an important tenet of Meyer's approach, and for the most part, the principles of this video will investigate parry-riposte setups. Of course, this isn't to say that we won't be using any single-time counterattacks. I'm sure many of you noticed that the absetzen used earlier was exactly this, a single-time counter. When timed correctly, these actions can be decisive, and we'll return to them when we discuss advantageous positions in parrying. For now, we can express this observation as a simple heuristic. Favour defense over uncertain offense. Or don't double out. Our next observation is on the amplitude of movement in some of the parries. Notice that in some of the parrying actions, the hand is held low and the blade is far offline, and the movements themselves are large and circular. This circularity is often considered characteristic of Meyer's system of fencing. Yet when we watch fences in a competition setting, we see a predominance of small, controlled actions, with large actions only occurring occasionally. We can understand movements in terms of amplitude. This diagram shows snapshots of a fencer across time as he cuts all the way down, swings all the way back up, and then comes back to long point. The distance that the fencer's hand moves away from the center line can be described as the amplitude of the movement. The larger the action, the greater the amplitude. The closer the hand to the center line, the smaller the amplitude. The time taken for this large amplitude cut depicted here is shown in the shaded section. Now let's add some intervening positions around the center line which aren't at full amplitude. The time of execution between the extents of a lower amplitude movement is significantly lower than that for a full amplitude action. This difference in time in taking the hand and the sword away from the center line has fencing implications, so let's see what Meyer says. Meyer addresses this when talking about two different distances of fencing. At the first distance, we are crossed at the tip of our blade with our opponent, and we are told we can perform high amplitude movements with sweeping deceptive actions. At the other, we're crossed further down the blade in the middle, and are told that we should never cut around with high amplitude actions unless we see a particular opportunity. Consider two fences with their blades just crossing at the weak. Both fences move to high amplitude starting positions, as indicated by the large red rings. If the fencer on the left chooses to attack, he has to perform a large hand and foot action to reach his opponent. This of course takes a significant duration, so the fencer on the right has plenty of time to react. Now let's consider a situation where the two fences are slightly closer together. From this mid-blade bind, the fencer on the right moves their hand and blade offline. From this position, the fencer on the left performs their attack. With the decreased distance, the fencer doesn't have to move their foot, and because of the centralized position of their hand, this is a very low amplitude action, so is extremely fast. The time for the opponent's defensive action remains constant with the previous circumstance, and so is slightly longer, with predictable consequences. To avoid having such a tempo taken advantage of, both fencers must ensure that their blades do not move into high amplitude actions as the distance closes between them. By adding these lines to the diagram, we can show the relationship between distance and amplitude. At the furthest extents, the fencers can use large amplitude actions because the tempo is large. As they converge, however, the amplitude of actions must decrease towards the center to match the correspondingly smaller tempo of the opponent's action. Perhaps we should call this the bow tie theory of fencing. Though to make it more interesting, we could call it the tie fighting theory. These reduced tempo small actions are directly advised by Meyer in his advice on how to deal with an opponent who is rapidly closing with us. In all parrying, you should not go out more than a hand's breadth to the side, up or down, from the midpoint where you hold your parrying, always keeping yourself within a circle around that center line. So how can we adapt the broad parrying techniques we've learned to these smaller actions? Let's look at a handful of examples. As usual, it's simply a case of diminishing the movement and adapting it slightly. In taking out with a false edge, we replace that large beat with a small expulsion upwards before following up with an attack. Likewise, in suppressing, the large downward cut, beating the blade out of the way, is replaced with a small tap and a follow-up riposte. The nature of the movement is kept the same, but the amplitude of the movement is greatly diminished. For slicing off, the large expulsion almost down to vexel is replaced with a simple opposition and a follow-up attack, much quicker and smaller. Finally, going through with the hanging blade works the same way, following up with a thrust or cut. Once again, we can express this as a heuristic. Calibrate the amplitude of your movements to the expected tempo of your opponent's attack. Put more simply, make sure your movement will be small enough to be quicker than theirs. Our next observation concerns the movement of the body, specifically that we move to vacate the line of attack. Vacating the line of the attack provides three simple benefits. First, the movement provides a failsafe for our sword action. Even if our parry is ineffective, we have moved out of the line of attack and so gain a slight margin of safety. Meyer points this out in his 1570 text, saying that we're not always adequately covered by our parrying, so we should withdraw the body or move it out of the way. Second, we can gain a little extra time to parry. Recall earlier that time and distance are one thing. By moving offline or away from the opponent's attack, we can gain fractions of a second to put into our own blade position. This may not seem like much, but in the middle of a fencing match, it can make all the difference. Third, by moving out of the line of the attack, we can often position ourselves advantageously for follow-up techniques such as a riposte. And this will become more important later. However, for now, we have one additional heuristic. Move to vacate the line of attack. A further observation concerns the central technique employed in all parrying. When we look at the parries, regardless of the initial position of our hand, the strong of our blade is specifically pushed across the attacking line. Sometimes this movement is linear, and in other cases it follows an arc, but the foundation of the action is always the same. The strong crosses the line. Many fencing books start with describing the blade and specifically calling out the strong and the weak section, and then we tend to forget about it. This is a missed opportunity because this focus on the strong provides a useful cognitive shortcut. Meyer summarizes this when he tells us to send our hilt before us as a shield with extended arm and turn the edge against incoming attacks. No matter where our hand is beginning or where we're positioned, if an opponent attacks, we simply push across the line with the strong, and more often than not we're protected from danger. This is especially useful when teaching beginners who lack the experience to take on the small details of some of the more complex techniques. However, if we simply instruct them on pushing the strong, very often they'll end up at the actual techniques organically as they train. Overall, this greatly simplifies our understanding of technique, and the heuristic here is that in all parrying we push across with the strong. Principles of strong and weak also come into play in our next observation. Parries should ideally end in a position of advantage. What exactly advantage means could be several things, so let's begin with structural advantage. Structural advantage is our ability to control our opponent's blade in the bind, using interactions of strong, weak, and relative weapon position. As we know, earlier period German fencing breaks the sword into the strong and the weak half of the blade. Meyer also identifies a middle section which effectively divides the sword into 4 equal segments, as depicted here in Meyer's text. Previously, in our discussion on amplitude, we talked about fencers who were in a weak bind, who could use large amplitude actions. We also talked about fencers who were in a mid-blade to mid-blade bind, wherein we needed to use smaller amplitude actions and couldn't cut around safely. Let's add a third blade interaction, which is a strong weak bind. This is advised in both parrying and in setting up actions, as we can see from this rapier text. In a strong weak bind, the strong of our blade is bound against the weak of the opponent's blade. This allows us to manipulate their blade through simple leverage. This prevents our opponent from pushing our sword out of the way, but also allows us to push through their sword into attack. Importantly, a strong weak bind needn't be at the extent of both our opponent's and our blade. In this diagram, the blue marked blade is in a stronger position than the red marked blade, even though it's not technically on the strong. When performing parrying actions, we very often start with this slight strong-weak advantage and then graduate along the opponent's weapon, gliding down their blade until we have a more secure strong-weak interaction. We see this advantage being gained from below in the technique of Absetzen. The graduation along the blade has achieved a position of advantage where we're easily able to displace our opponent's weapon. Likewise, we see the graduation of the blade to achieve structural advantage being put to good effect in this slight slicing off parry to the right. The strong weak bind is used throughout the movement, graduating along the blade to entirely displace the opponent's weapon. Meyer's writings convey the essence of this. We should drive first from the weak, then to the strong, and then to the body. In the weak we can overpower him, in the strong we can force him in between, and between the two we displace correctly and work diligently in every engagement. Interestingly, there are other ways we can achieve structural advantage, and the most obvious one is being over the opponent's blade in the bind. We noticed this in the slicing off before. As we graduate along the blade, we actually find ourselves over the top of the opponent's blade. Covering their weapon in this way puts them into a state of subjection, whereby we can use our body weight and our larger muscles, and they are constrained to using the smaller muscles of their shoulder and wrist to resist us. As Meyer puts it, he has the best inner cut who comes with his weapon above the others in the cutting, remembering that in Meyer, cuts and parries are fundamentally the same actions. These principles come together as a new heuristic. In our oppositional parries, we should establish structural advantage, and we can do this through strong weak positions, graduation, and binding over the opponent's blade. In addition to gaining structural advantage, there is another type of advantage we can gain while parrying, and that is the advantage of tempo. We should position ourselves such that at the end of our parrying action, the tempo of the opponent's renewal, either over or under our blade, will be greater than the tempo of our riposte. Consider the two fencers shown. The fencer who has achieved the overbind has a very low amplitude riposte, which will be very quick. By comparison, their opponent will have to cross entirely over the top of the fencer's blade to reach them. This is a relatively high amplitude action and hence has a large tempo. Alternatively, they might try to disengage under, but this is also a somewhat high amplitude action taking the blade out of line and is highly susceptible to being interfered with by counterattacks. In Meyer's words, whoever will deceive his opponent by pulling around or changing through makes himself open or shortens his reach, unless he is very quick. None of this should be a surprise based on our discussion of amplitude earlier. However, let's look at a few other factors related to this advantage. Earlier in the video, we talked about vacating the line of attack by moving off to the side, and this is also an element of gaining an advantage of tempo. As we move off to the side, we have actually placed ourselves in a position where our opponent's renewal has to go a very long distance around our blade. Compare this to the same parry without the stepping off line. We still have an excellent displacement and good position. However, when we view the two side by side, it becomes immediately apparent that the offline action generates a larger tempo of renewal for the opponent, giving us the advantage of time. Seen from the side, we notice that the slight offline movement creates that position of advantage for the fast riposte. Let's look at that whole movement again and freeze it here. It's at this point that the fencer on the right has to make decisions in real time about whether they should riposte or retreat defensively, and that decision making is based on feeling. If they feel the opponent taking away, they should instantaneously riposte. If they feel that they are under threat, then they should move back to a position of safety. So in addition to body positioning and to blade positioning, we have the concern of feeling. Meyer talks about this in his Sidesword section. He tells us that in a bind with our blade on theirs, as soon as we feel them going away to cut around or to thrust under, that we should thrust at them or attack them and turn the long edge against their blade. He tells us this feeling is how we test and discover how he will go away from the bind. Feeling, then, is the pivoting point about which we make our choices surrounding advantages of tempo. This reaction to the feeling of the opponent's blade is what is known as Indes in the German fencing system, and is highlighted by earlier masters as being the very key to the art of fencing. It is not enough to simply achieve a position of advantage. We need to convert that advantage into an actual, tangible outcome, and this should be at the core of much of our fencing practice. Based on all of this, we have a new heuristic. We should frame our parry to extend our opponent's tempo. We do this by ensuring that they have to move the long way around our blade, and as they do so, we react to feeling instantaneously. Meyer offers additional advice on how we can minimize the tempo of our riposte, and put simply, at the end of our parrying action, we should have our point in a position which threatens our opponent whenever possible. Manuscript 3227A is more specific about this, saying that as soon as you come upon someone's sword, your point shall never be more than 3 handbreadths away from the opponent's face or chest. As always, it's tempting to jump straight to Absetzen as the example of this, because indeed Absetzen threatens the face and chest with the point immediately, and so is the perfect example. However, considering our low amplitude versions of techniques that we looked at earlier, we can see that many of the other parrying actions can end in a position which threatens the face or chest with the point. Because the techniques are low amplitude, they work better against smaller cuts and thrusts. When performed this way, even percussive actions like suppressing or taking out with a false edge can be used to effectively keep the point in presence, making them a constant threat to the opponent. The one technique which proves difficult to keep the point in play with is the hanging parry. This is because it relies on the circular movement of the cut to follow up. There are some efforts to remediate this with certain actions, but they're not exactly what I would call consistently reliable in fencing. There are other cases, however, where this attempt to keep the point in play really shines, turning a two-tempo parry riposte into a single-time counter. We see a similar effect with taking out with hanging blade, thrusting straight to the opponent's midsection. Even if we don't quite get the point perfectly on line, we still notice a marked improvement over the technique, allowing an instantaneous riposte to the body. So let's add a new heuristic. In parrying, we should threaten the point to further improve our tempo, and as a side effect, this often allows us to turn parry riposte into single-time counters. Don't forget, this video only collects a handful of heuristics together and is far from exhaustive, but let's recap what we've talked about so far. Across the video, we've collected 7 basic heuristics. The first is that we should favour defence over uncertain attack. Second, we should calibrate the amplitude of our action to the expected tempo of the opponent. Third, we should move to vacate the line of attack. Fourth, we cross the line with the strong. Fifth, we should always oppose with structural advantage. Sixth, we should always frame our parry to extend their tempo. Finally, we should threaten with the point to narrow our own tempo. Now that we have these heuristics, what exactly do we do with them? Well, there are actually several things. Firstly, we can use them to deconstruct other techniques from the existing text. For example, we can look at other techniques in Meyer to see if any of these principles fit there also. Second, we could use them as a point of comparison for other systems. You may have noticed that as the amplitude of our movements became smaller, it began to look more and more like rapier, so we could use these same principles as a point of comparison with rapier texts. Third, we can use them as pedagogical teaching aids. Many of these heuristics can be used to develop skills with newly starting students without having to introduce them to a complex series of actions. Finally, and most importantly for our own fencing, we can use these heuristics in skill development. We do this by constructing drills to exercise these very principles. And this is perhaps the most important part of this entire process. We deconstruct all of the techniques, extract the principles, and use those to make ourselves better at fencing. And there you have it. Thanks for watching.